Stanford University.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to listen to me speak. I'm quite excited about this. Sort of, I guess, by way of introduction, since I haven't met all of you yet, my general research interests focus on, or most generally can be described as understanding and reducing the environmental impacts of fossil energy systems. Most of the research I've done in this area focuses on life cycle assessment of alternative transportation fuels. What I'm going to talk about today is sort of my well, more fun maybe and more interesting and more general sort of work on modeling this transition to oil substitutes and what the impacts might be on a much broader sort of systemic scale. So this has a fair bit of economics in it, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I do my best, but I've actually recently recruited a full-fledged economist to help me with this because I. Is it possible to turn out those lights? Yeah. So this work will involve a fair bit of economics and sort of kind of mathematical modeling. Also, I'm going to be presenting some kind of new results that are works in progress. I'm doing this because A, I think it'll be a little bit more interesting for both me and for you guys. And B, also, I figure I don't get a chance to present to a room full of sort of very smart and very broadly trained people very often. So I'm actively looking for advice on where to go with this. So broad overview. First, I'm going to talk about the risks of what I call the oil transition, namely the economic, strategic, and environmental risks of the oil transition. And I'll describe what I mean by that in a second. Second, I'm going to talk about modeling this oil transition specifically. First, I'm going to talk about system dynamics and behavior. And second, I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to talk about modeling the behavior and the dynamics of the energy supply system. And second, I'm going to talk about using this model for improving decision making, since that's why we want to build these models. So the oil transition actually has already begun. Petroleum production is eventually going to peak and decline. By that, I mean production of conventionally produced petroleum. This is necessitated by the fact that it's a finite geologic resource. The peak is going to be, it's very complex to determine when this peak is going to happen, and it's going to be determined by a variety of geologic, economic, and political factors. For that reason, I happen to be extremely skeptical about the ability of anyone to predict using models or data when this is actually going to occur, and I don't actually think that that's necessarily the most important question either, which I will also get to. The response to this peak is not going to be sort of calamity or general energy shortages, despite what some people might suggest, but I think instead actually it will be a transition to substitutes for conventional petroleum. It will induce and sort of support this transition. We're going to transition, I think, to a variety of fossil and bio-based liquid fuels, as well as potentially, or as well as especially in the longer term, other energy carriers such as electricity and hydrogen. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on other energy carriers. I'm not really going to talk about electricity and hydrogen. Or I'm going to focus on liquid fuels. I'm not really going to talk about these other energy carriers. When I said the oil transition is underway, I actually meant that it's been underway for about 30 years. This graph plots the production of all liquid fuels that are not classified as primary or secondary oil production or natural gas liquids. So this includes what's called tertiary oil production or enhanced oil recovery, which is just basically more intensive extraction techniques, often more energy intensive. We have tar sands, which is a heavy hydrocarbon that's typically mined from the earth and upgraded into a synthetic crude oil. We have extra heavy oil from Venezuela, which is another significant resource and is functionally like the oil sands. We have much smaller gas liquids, coal liquids, and oil shale. These are synthetic fuels produced from either natural gas, coal, or oil shale, which are hydrocarbon or which are fossil fuel materials that are not in liquid form in their native state. They can be converted into a liquid fuel, though. Lastly, the green bar here, we have ethanol, which has been growing the most rapidly of them. And especially this graph ends in 2004. Since then, it has been growing, still growing rapidly. You can see here that total production is approaching 3,500 kilobarrels per day, or 3.5 million barrels per day, which is just over 4% of global liquid fuels production. So basically, this is already occurring. This is a sort of a gradual process that will continue to occur as conventional oil declines. One thing that people often are concerned about with respect to peak oil is the general availability of fuels, or whether there will be a shortage. And I don't think that's actually what we should be concerned about. Fossil fuels are really abundant. If you take reserve plus resource estimates and then you apply conversion factors to go from, say, coal to a liquid fuel or natural gas to a liquid fuel, the remaining, the liquid fuel production potential is easily 15 times what we've consumed throughout industrial history from 1860 to the present. So in short, there's no shortage of fossil fuels. Biofuels are quite a bit more difficult to put a firm number on. Well, they're more difficult for a number of reasons. The ultimate limit to biofuel production is the net primary productivity of ecosystems. Net primary productivity being the total solar energy gathered by photosynthetic organisms less that they consume for their metabolic processes. We cannot and should not and would not want to come anywhere close to this limit. NPP, is our fuel. It's the fuel for all the critters that we like to keep as pets or raise for food, or this sort of thing. Basically, it fuels all heterotrophic organisms that don't make their own food. Currently, this is quite an astounding figure. Humanity already appropriates between 20 and 40% of terrestrial net primary productivity. Not all of this is certainly in combustion processes. Most of this is actually, for livestock or grain production and things like this. But we already appropriate a huge amount of the terrestrial productivity. Opinions differ really widely. This was something fun. I was researching this summer on the availability of biofuels. Chris Field and others here at Stanford a couple years ago estimated using fairly conservative and I think pretty reasonable constraints that maybe we could come up with 30 exajoules per year of sustainable yield. And this doesn't involve conversion of active farmlands to energy crop production, and doesn't involve a conversion of forests either. On the absolute other end of the spectrum, we have this interesting quote, and I had to read it twice because it seemed so kind of out there to me. We have energy farming in current agricultural land alone could contribute over 800 exajoules without affecting the world's food supply. That to me seems fairly optimistic because total primary energy consumption right now is 450 to 500 exajoules. And so that's this very sort of optimistic view of future potential yields and potential increases with fertilization. And so there's really a wide range of opinions about how much we could obtain from biofuels. So I mentioned at the beginning there are 3 risks associated with this oil transition, and now I'll go through these in order. The environmental risks stated most broadly are that producing liquid fuels are going to worsen the environmental problems we're already facing, such as climate change or biodiversity loss. Liquid substitutes for conventional petroleum, when I use this acronym SCPs, that's substitutes for conventional petroleum, typically have higher greenhouse gas emissions, with cellulosic fuels being the big exception. Higher greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, than conventional fuels. Non-liquid substitutes typically have lower emissions, such as compressed natural gas. Most electricity cycles into a vehicle, even some coal-based cycles, will have lower overall well-to-wheels emissions. Biofuels, interestingly, are really going to shift the environmental burdens of transportation. We're going to shift from this kind of stuff I do, greenhouse gas accounting, efficiencies and things like this, to stuff that people who study environmental impacts of agriculture have worried about for 30 years. We have ecosystem change, deforestation, water pollution with fertilizer runoff, this sort of thing. So it's really going to, I think if there's a big shift, that's really going to shift the focus of where we need to pay attention. The greenhouse gas impacts of liquid oil substitutes really vary. On the left here, we have conventional oil with a range of in the low 80s to almost 100. The unit here is grams of CO2 per megajoule of refined fuel delivered to the vehicle. This is a somewhat cumbersome term that's sort of become the standard way to measure these things in the literature, so that's why I present. So with oil, the range is primarily due to the efficiency of extraction and the amount of vented methane it's associated with oil production. So you can see here as we move to tar sands, gas liquids, oil shale, coal liquids, these fossil-based substitutes, the emissions increase fairly significantly, approaching 2 times conventional oil emissions for the high end of oil shale and for coal liquids. On a side note, if any of you are graduate students and are concerned about sort of narrowing in on really small focused things that seem like they're just really tiny things, about a good fraction of the last 2 years of my graduate career were spent getting that number and that number up there. So 2 points on the graph. Took most of the last couple years of my life, so don't feel too bad. It will end sometime. On the right here, we have grain ethanol and cellulosic ethanol. You can see here that we have this really huge uncertainty range with these. This uncertainty range is actually applied by a really sort of controversial and well-cited article by a guy named Tim Searchinger and others that was published in Science last year. These represent about 100 grams of carbon per megajoule, and those are the emissions associated with what they call indirect market-mediated land use change. So the idea here is that you convert corn into biofuels. This raises the price of corn and other agricultural crops on the global market and induces people in other countries to basically chop down the forest and plant crops. And so this effect could be quite large, and that's primarily due to the low energy, the low power capture rate of biofuels. Photosynthesis is not very efficient, and so you end up affecting large amounts of land. The economic risks are plainly that transportation fuels are going to become more expensive, either in the short term or the long term, reducing economic growth and development. The short-term risks we all know are primarily associated with volatility and price spikes. People talk about associations between price spikes and recessions, and there's academic debate about cause and effect. But clearly, a future transportation system, we would want our fuels to be less volatile in price than what we currently have. The long-term risks, I think, are associated with the fact that cheap, reliable transportation really is a very fundamental economic good. People will argue this, and I think they're mostly right, that we've really reached saturation in rich countries. So additional availability of transportation fuels to our society won't necessarily do us a lot of good, but this is not, most emphatically not the case in poor countries. And there are many, many bad things that can be said about the oil industry. One good thing that can be said about the oil industry, and one very profound good thing, is that it provides low-cost, reliable transportation to literally billions of people around the world every single day, which is not something that can be said for a lot of alternatives. And so that's really what we're looking for, is something that provides this economic good at affordable costs. The energy security risks are basically that securing the supply of fuels is going to result in a world with more conflict, less peace, less justice, and less these sort of these other sort of more politically or socially oriented goods. The strategic risks associated with transportation fuels arise mainly from the fact that over 95% of the transportation, the energy consumed in global transportation systems comes from petroleum and petroleum products. This level of dependence is really unmatched in any other sector, and it causes strategic concerns because basically the access to transportation is important both for, in times of conflict and for economic growth in general. Related to this point, we have here a guy in the Air Force unveiling a certified synthetic fuel, a plane that's certified to use synthetic fuel blend. The Air Force is currently certifying all their planes over the next couple of years to run on a blend of 50% coal liquids, 50% conventional oil. And so here's an unveiling ceremony. Also, sort of a more subtle point, large oil revenues can be really disruptive to exporting countries, causing their governments to have the ability to ignore or suppress democratic movements, and also causing something that's been called the resource curse. The extremely large monetary flows associated with exporting oil, basically give great incentive for sort of corrupt and unaccountable behavior, and this results in a lot of things that we don't really like. So ideally, in the future, we'd move away from this sort of behavior. So then the question arises, and this is for the second half of the talk, or a number of questions arise. First, what can we do to mitigate these sort of three risks that are kind of intertwined? Are there solutions that address multiple risks at once? Humanity has a long track record of finding solutions that address the immediate problem at hand and ended up causing worse problems later on. This obviously is not the fault of anyone who's solving the problems, it's just that there are unforeseen consequences, and it's hard to solve problems sometimes. And third, and most relevant to the second half of this talk, can quantitative models point to these kinds of solutions that address multiple risks at once? And I think there is some evidence that they can, or they can at least help. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Off and on for the last 4 years, I've worked on something called ROMEO, Regional Optimization Model for Emissions from Oil Substitutes. Maybe it should have been called Romeos, I don't know. It's a little more exciting too exciting if you have too many Romeos around, I guess. I've enlisted a number of collaborators over the years that I'd like to acknowledge. I'm working currently with Deepak Rajagopal, who's a postdoc in agricultural and resource econ up at Berkeley. He's helping me with biofuels and with the economic modeling. Rich Plevin, who's a student up at Berkeley, helped me do some of the programming, and my former advisor, Alex Farrell, helped with some of the conception, the initial conception. Funding for this work was provided by the National Science Foundation and the UC Energy Institute while I was a graduate student. So ROMEO models future liquid fuel production. It includes 5 fossil fuels and 2 biofuels. It models production and consumption in 17 world regions over 50 years. It's structured as an economic optimization model where each year is optimized independently without foresight. So basically what this means is the model in each model year attempts to invest in fuel production capacity, supply fuels, and ship fuels around the planet in the least cost way. And this sort of mimics the functioning of a perfect market, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. It includes 3 modules that are important and nonlinear and cause interesting model behavior, including demand response. It includes technological learning. So technologies, the cost drops over time as we increase cumulative production of a resource. And it includes depletion, which increases the cost of resources. I'm going to, for the most part, talking today, I'm going to avoid technical details and just focus on results. But the demand model, it's a partial adjustment model, basically based entirely off the work of Cooper. This is a model that's linear in the log of price, income, and a lagged term representing the previous year's demand. What this actually allows is it simultaneously accounts for short and long run impacts of price or income changes. So when the price spikes, you have a response in this year, people drive less, right? But you have a response in future years, they buy a Prius instead of an SUV, and then that causes savings for 10 or 15 years in the future. And so this demand model includes both of these effects. The model has some strengths and weaknesses. The resource data are quite strong. I have country-level data, generally at low, medium, and high levels for all of these fossil and biofuels. And it does include a really flexible structure. So this could, you can easily add technologies to it, or you could easily change the regional structure to allow it to be used as a submodule within a larger model, for example, which is nice. Technologies are defined pretty simply. They're defined, but they're just kind of a black box with a few parameters representing them: costs, greenhouse gas emissions, efficiency of conversion from the primary resource to the fuel. And the market is fairly simple. This model of Cooper, it doesn't include a separate market for bioproducts right now, although I'd like to add that. And it doesn't include any of the sort of wrinkles we might think are really interesting about the oil market. It doesn't include non-competitive behavior, politics, or regulation, any of the things that really make the oil market more interesting than a lot of other markets. And the reason it doesn't include those basically is because they're very difficult to model. A really important part of the model is the depletion module. This causes variable costs to increase as a resource is depleted. The fossil fuel module is taken from the work of David Green at Oak Ridge Lab. And it's a logistic depletion multiplier that basically makes variable costs approach infinity as the fraction of the resource consumed approaches 1. So basically this prevents you from ever depleting the resource entirely. Biofuels, the resource that's accounted for is terrestrial above-ground net primary productivity. So I'm assuming we're not going to be digging up roots to make biofuels, and I'm assuming we're not going to use oceanic ecosystems. Those are obviously just assumptions. It does include exogenous net primary productivity consumption in other sectors. This basically is the amount of bioproducts we consume in the form of vegetables, meat, milk, this sort of thing. And this external consumption does grow with the economy, although it doesn't interact with the market mechanism, and that's currently a weakness right now. But I do assume that it grows quite conservatively at a rate quite a bit less than the income elasticity of consumption of most of those products individually. And so it does account for some price response effect. There are external constraints placed on the total amount of NPP that can be converted into grain-producing plants and the overall fraction of NPP that can be consumed. And I set these just like I have a very wide range of estimates for resources. I have a very wide range here for the fraction of NPP. I say that the upper limit, the absolute upper limit, where costs approach infinity is at 75% of NPP. This obviously is very sort of generous and wide bounds. In a world where we were consuming 75% of NPP would be a very different world and would look significantly worse in many ways. But like I said, I try to set the bounds pretty wide to not constrain the behavior of the model. So here are some typical results. Here's oil production across 17 regions. The big ones are the Middle East in orange and former Soviet Union in gray. What happens is the oil production continues along until each region reaches a set ratio of production to remaining resources. And then production declines thereafter using an exponential model. This is a much more vigorous, this is sort of on the high end of potential decline rates. I chose this as an illustrative case because that allows more production of substitutes. But this is definitely on the upper end of what we'd expect from depletion. And this case includes medium USGS projections for how much oil we might have. That's from the US Geological Survey. So basically, that might be what would happen to oil in this illustrative case. And then the result would be that instead of total fuel production dropping, actually we would produce a variety of substitutes. And this illustrative case I showed because it shows this sort of massive transition where we have significant production of tar sands, grain ethanol, huge amounts of gas liquids produced, and then by 2050, significant amounts of coal conversion going on. The result with respect to the oil price is that the price starts out low in the year 2000, and then by the time this peak and decline happens, has to rise significantly to induce production of these alternative resources. So basically what's going on here is that the price has to rise high enough in order to induce producers who want to make a profit in order to invest in and produce these resources. This price actually represents the marginal cost of production of the most expensive barrel of resources needed to meet demand is actually how the price is modeled. You can get weird, and I submitted the first paper on this model this summer, and this paper was mostly about sort of the variability inherent in this system. You can get really wide ranges. On the left here, I have per capita GDP growth essentially is frozen. We go to 1% in the developing world, 0% in the developed world. We have a low UN population projection, and we have high amounts of oil available. In this case, basically, actually, demand starts to drop over time, you'll see. And this is because over the time period at which the econometric demand model was estimated, you actually have what's called a decoupling between oil use and economic growth. So the amount of oil used per unit of GDP from 1970 to 2005 has dropped between 1 and 1.5% per year. And so basically, when you freeze global GDP growth, what actually ends up happening is we end up substituting away from conventional oil. You don't get the peak until 2040 or 2035, and we don't end up using much synthetic fuel. This opposite case is sort of this insane out-of-control case where we have 4% per capita growth in the developing world, 2% in the developed, a high UN population growth scenario. So basically, we have a high economic growth, high population growth, and not much oil, low USGS estimates. And then we have this absolutely massive coal liquids industry by 2050 that rivals the size of the current oil industry. So basically the point here is not that either of these are going to come true, but just that there's really wide variability in what this model can produce with pretty minor tweaks in the input data. Similarly, you can model the effect of policies or technologies and get wide changes. On the left, we have the effect of a carbon tax that starts at $25 a ton and increases $2 per year. Essentially, that eliminates the production of coal liquids. You move entirely to natural gas. On the right, we have cheap cellulosic ethanol. My initial data for cellulosic ethanol are based on the initial commercial scale plant that Iogen was planning on constructing in Idaho, although it appears that that plant has since been canceled. This was a 30 million gallon per year cellulosic ethanol plant. Those were the initial capital costs. So instead of waiting for this technological learning effect to occur, where you produce cellulosic ethanol over time and the cost drops as technological learning happens, what if we just half those prices initially, as if through some technological breakthrough or some really advanced process becomes developed? In that case, cellulosic ethanol really begins to dominate, and by 2050 supplies about 1/3 of total fuel supplies. So we can pause to consider the problems with this sort of modeling for a second. This sort of large-scale energy systems modeling is frequently criticized, and I think sometimes for good reason. The most evocative language, Václav Smil, who I have as much respect for as anyone who writes on energy these days, he called the IPCC models in the letters section of Nature, he called them computerized fairy tales. And he has a whole chapter in his 2003 book called Against Forecasting. And he says, we have these huge failures of imagination where we really can't know what the world's going to be like in 2050, what technologies we're going to invent. So these models are, he says, are just sort of these fairy tales. I'm not so skeptical about their usefulness. I think they can really help us by helping us keep track of obviously incredibly complex calculations. This model has about 100,000 decision variables, over all 50 years. You obviously can't do that by hand. It also helps you tie together sort of disparate bits of knowledge that about this system that come out in different focused studies. So I can get one paper that's on a model of global oil supply and demand. I can get another paper that's on oil shale resources. I can get a third paper on coal conversion technologies. All told, this paper encompasses, I collected them today in a bibliography, about 2 to 3 dozen important primary papers that each focus on a different aspect of the system. And just reading them and trying to come up in your mind with what the overall conclusion is going to be is very difficult. But by building a model, you can sort of tie these things together in a quantitative and mathematically rigorous way. So I think there is usefulness there. And obviously, these models hurt because prediction is very problematic about the long-term future. And the range illustrated by 2 slides ago is really larger than most of us would imagine. The range of potential futures, at least. Nonetheless, we're faced with acting in a world that is fundamentally uncertain. We do this all the time. We sort of act and make decisions and try to make the future better in a world that's uncertain. So how can we use modeling despite this uncertainty? Rob Lempert, who's at Rand and has done some really interesting work on this area over the last decade, says we should avoid what he calls the predict then act form of systems modeling. So this predict then act formulation really arises from the natural sciences, where you have a system that behaves according to well-regulated and easily quantifiable relationships, and then you can predict how the system is going to act and change your behavior accordingly. You can't really do that with people and economies and economic growth and this sort of thing. They say that actually optimization is actively problematic or harmful under these sorts of situations, because if you optimize for a given future, the result actually often becomes suboptimal because that future never arrives. So they suggest a combination of optimization techniques called multi-objective and robust optimization will actually help us to make better decisions. And this is what I'm actively working on right now with the model. So here's a quote from them. They say, rather than first predicting the future in order to act on it, we should instead gain a systematic understanding of the best near-term options for shaping the future or for making actions in the absence of any reliable predictions. Right? So this is sort of a flip on the conventional take. So instead of predicting the future and trying to determine what to do, you say, we can't predict the future, what should we do given that we can't predict the future? There are at least 3 characteristics of robust actions. So Lempert and others were working on this. Also John Wyatt, who's here in management science and engineering, has done a little bit of work on this. Basically, a robust action is going to have 3 characteristics. It's going to cause improvement in the future despite variation in uncertain inputs. So we want a robust action that we take now, a technology we develop, a policy that we invent, or a policy that we institute, to have benefit despite or no matter what sort of values certain variable inputs take. So we want our action to have benefit whether economic growth is, global economic growth is 4% per year or 1% per year, or whether population growth is high or low. We also want an action to cause improvement despite variation in how we think the world might work. So if you disagree with my demand module, that's fine. I don't necessarily think it's the best demand model ever. You might want to put in a different demand model instead. A robust action would actually provide benefit no matter what reasonable, sort of plausible scientifically defensible modules were plugged in. Accounting for reasonable disagreement, of course, about how the world might work. And lastly, an action is robust if it generates improvement despite or in spite of the variation in metrics we might use to measure improvement. So for example, one person might be more interested in energy security, another person might be more interested in greenhouse gas emissions. So ideally, a really robust action would have benefits on both of those fronts. Now, is anything that we do going to have robustness at all these levels? Is probably not. But at least this is a template with which we can compare things and think about, and basically think about the trade-offs involved. So I've implemented this sort of robustness and multi-objective approach in Romeo, basically by creating a 2D slice through 2 very important parameters, the growth rate in global income and the amount of conventional oil available. And then I sample across these 2 variables to basically get indicator metrics for a variety of indicator metrics for these large number of scenarios. So economic metrics include the average oil price, the highest oil price. Environmental metrics include the greenhouse gases or the fraction of net primary productivity consumed as sort of a proxy for ecosystem damages. Energy security includes the fraction of resources generated from the largest producing region and the fraction from the largest fuel type. So we have these 6 metrics, and I'm going to sort of look at how we can look at them simultaneously. So here's the result of one of these robustness or sensitivity calculations. On the y-axis here, we have the global conventional oil endowment. On the left-hand side is this low USGS estimate. On the right-hand side is the high one. And on the y-axis, we have growth in global income from basically nothing to about 4% or 4.5% per year, compounded. So you can see here that the average price per barrel, which is this metric, increases as we move from a high oil, low demand sort of world to a low oil, high demand sort of world, which makes sense. If we have lots of demand and not much oil, we're going to be producing a lot of coal liquids, and the price is going to go up. Because the model is nonlinear, there's a little bit of variation at the rate at which the price increases. Similarly, we can plot total emissions. This is units of gigatons of CO2, and you can see these increase fairly uniformly with growth in global income. You can see there's actually not a lot of variation along the x-axis here. And this is the first paper I actually wrote on this subject. They said, well, if we run out of oil sooner, we're going to produce a lot more coal liquids. Total emissions are going to be a lot higher. Actually, most of that effect is counteracted by the fact that coal liquids are so much more expensive. So coal liquids have double the emissions, but they're actually significantly more expensive. And so you'll reduce economic growth and you'll reduce consumption of fuels overall. So there is some effect where less oil equals more emissions, but that's significantly mitigated. So I test the changes associated with 3 near-term actions: cheap cellulosic technology, which I showed earlier, a carbon tax, which I also showed earlier, and then lastly, a demand reduction. This is an increase in 0.5% per year in the rate at which this decoupling happens, and the rate at which we use less oil per unit of economic output. And so this corresponds to basically an efficiency improvement or an increase in the production of hybrid cars or things like this. So we can plot the before and after emissions associated with cheaper cellulosic ethanol. We go from the upper left to the lower right. You can see emissions drop overall. And then we can plot those as a delta, as a percentage change. And you can see that overall emissions drop in nearly all cases, and they drop a little bit more in this high demand, low oil sort of corner of the world. We can also look at similar difference plots across these six metrics. The environmental ones are on the left, the economic ones are in the middle, and the energy security ones are on the right. So you can see that cellulosic ethanol is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in nearly all scenarios, but significantly increase NPP consumption on a percentage basis, especially in the low scenarios. That's because it's starting from a low baseline. You can see that actually it improves regional concentration and fuel concentration. Regional concentration mostly because cellulose is more evenly distributed around the planet than fossil fuel resources are. So as we move away from oil, we're going to move into a world where fuels are produced more evenly around the world. There's really no Middle East of cellulose, except perhaps maybe the rainforests, which we don't necessarily want to go there anyway. So, demand reduction, this sort of increase in efficiency, tends to have more evenly beneficial results. Greenhouse gas emissions and NPP go down. The price goes down generally. Whereas, interestingly, the fuel concentration and the regional concentration actually increase. And this is an interesting thing. You'd say, well, why would increased efficiency increase our reliance on a given region for fuel supplies? And actually, this is because it just prolongs the time over which oil is the dominant fuel by reducing demand. And so that increases the regional concentration because oil is a very unevenly distributed resource. Thirdly, a carbon tax lowers greenhouse gas emissions, but significantly increases average cost and highest price. And interestingly, also increases the fuel concentration pretty significantly. And this is because it induces a massive switch to natural gas-based fuels because those have low CO2 emissions. So that increases our reliance on natural gas, which, of course, may be something we're willing to do in order to achieve lower greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the value in these plots is that it lets us look at sort of multiple indicators at once and think about, okay, what are the trade-offs that we're willing to make between something like NPP consumption, which represents ecosystem damages, and something else like fuel concentration, which represents sort of our vulnerability to fuel exporters. And so that's sort of the value of these combined plots. So in conclusion, I really think there is potential for this sort of modeling to aid in making a beneficial oil transition rather than one that future generations look back on and say, well, that was a bad idea. This is because models can help us understand this really complex problem, provided that, and I think this is important, that the models generated sort of take into account at the very beginning the uncertainty and the variability in people's motivations and goals. And when you work from that sort of framework, I think this modeling of these large systems ends up being more useful. Next steps, this is a work in progress. I'm sure I'm just going to keep kind of plugging away a little bit at a time on this. I'm interested in improving the modeling of the markets. I'm really interested in refining these metrics of comparison. So if anyone has any ideas about which of these 6 metrics should be replaced with something else, not the highest oil price, but instead it should be some measure of volatility or something like that, feel free to talk to me about that or ask me about it. Lots of work needs to be done on visualization. We're sort of live in a 3-dimensional world. Ideally, these 2D slices would be multiple slices across multiple dimensions. So in that way, you could say, well, actually, the danger region is where we have high demand, high demand due to high economic growth, low oil availability, and actually say the price of technologies doesn't drop as fast, and our ability to expand infrastructure is less. That might be sort of a high danger world. And so if you can look across multiple variables at once, that would be nice. Of course, it's very difficult to plot and visualize that. And then obviously, this is really calling out for adding electricity as sort of an 8th fuel to allow it to compete with these liquid fuels. That would be really nice. And would allow for asking some more interesting questions of the model. So that's it. Thank you to the organizers and attendees, all you for attending. And I want to thank again my collaborators and funding sources. Any questions? Oh.
I said a question about the Romeo model. So you have electricity as a fuel for vehicles, but you have electricity as a demand for gas and coal and biofuels.
I do, actually. Those are exogenous to the model, and those come from one of the IPCC models. I just basically pulled demand for natural gas and coal and other fuels from other sectors, non-transportation sectors, out of those models, and I just treat those as a given. Obviously, I'm kind of taking a partial analysis, holding the rest of the world constant, because I'm a graduate student and not a national lab, so I can't devote as much effort to it. So, or I was a graduate student.
How about over there? Are you looking at anything regarding algae biodiesel?
I don't have algae fuels in there. That would obviously be something to add. I actually also don't have sugar-based ethanol. So those would be a couple contenders. I was just working on this sort of part-time over the summer. So that would be something interesting to add. That would get into sort of aquatic productivity and stuff, which would change the equation a little bit.
All right, how about back on the brown shirt?
Two questions. One quickly, have you run this model in reverse, much like a lot of climate skeptics try to do with the IPCC model? How does it predict things that have happened?
Yeah, it doesn't end up doing very well. I've only played with it a little bit, but that's something I'll admit. That's fine. Yeah, no. Yeah.
And then the other question is, you're really looking at transportation fuels, and it seems like you assume that you have the ability to keep using more and more fuel even in developed countries. That's roughly true.
It depends on the scenario. I mean, in the low scenarios, I have zero growth in the developed countries, but yeah, in the high ones, I do have continued growth.
My question is, people in the United States and say potentially in the future, India and China simply run out of time to drive their cars with?
We can hope, yeah. I mean,
How many hours a day can you drive your car?
yeah, I mean, there's interesting people have looked at, if you've seen any of these time budget studies, they say where you look at the amount of time people spend commuting over really long, hundreds of years sort of time periods. They exhume from these historical records how long people commuted in London in 1850 and things like this. And they say that there is this limit where people aren't willing to really commute more than an hour each way, I think is their sort of rough figure they say. So yeah, that could be the case, but a lot of the growth in developed countries, especially in Europe, as far as I understand it, has been in aviation. And sort of tourism and sort of hobby travel to, I want to go to Boston for the weekend. Going to Boston for the weekend is traveling 6,000 miles, and the average, at least the average fleet efficiency for the aircraft fleet is approximately, last time I looked, was around 35 miles per gallon. So it's not much better than driving to Boston and back in terms of fuel use. And so this sort of, aviation has the potential to, to really negate this, because you can burn a lot of fuel very fast in an airplane. Is basically the short answer. But yeah, that is a consideration.
So your model looks at a number of factors that assume that are linear, such as vehicle miles traveled against income and vehicle ownership against income.
It actually doesn't specify things that specifically.
My question was, so the game changer would be if people decided, well, I like my electric Vespa, and I can go 50, 75 watt hours per mile,
Sure.
and I own one vehicle, and I'll drive this thing for maybe 50 miles a day.
Yeah.
That might be a game changer, or personal rapid transit, so that you don't spend 10 hours in an airplane.
Sure.
You do 20 hours in a train.
Sure. The only way, so the model is coarse enough on the economic side to where the only thing I could approximate that with was this decoupling rate. So this was this decoupling between the oil use and the growth in global economic output, basically. And so by increasing that from this 1 to 1.5% historical rate that we've seen over the last 35 years, where each year we use 1 to 1.5% less oil per unit of economic output, I increase that by 5% and say maybe it's 1.5%, maybe it's 2%, right? And so you shift that range up, which essentially sort of accelerates this decoupling away from oil. And that could be strengthened further to, you know, an additional 1%, although that would be, that sort of great of a shift would be stretching the bounds of probably what would be kind of plausible, because those trends are kind of deep set, I think. But yeah, that's a good point.
Were your values for the models adjusted for inflation?
Yeah, this was all in real terms. Yeah, so these are all real $2,000.
You, as one of your measures, you had regional sort of how it's spread out across the world. Have you looked at all at how stable each of these fuel sources is in terms of if there's a crisis, like we've had oil crises, or if there's a natural disaster, famine, exactly?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I haven't looked at that. So that might be, I wonder how that could be done, maybe with some sort of index of variability of output and compare crops or agricultural productivity to fuels. That would be an interesting metric to compute. Yeah, that's a good idea.
So I think some of your plots had CO2 emissions and some of them said greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
Are you looking at only CO2?
Actually, I am. Yeah, so that's shorthand.
Do you have any plans to include the defects of incomplete combustion or other new fuels?
Yeah. I don't have any plans currently. One of the big ones that I was just talking about at lunch with a couple of people is, for example, N2O emissions from agriculture and from fertilized crops. So if we start fertilizing energy crops, it's not that much N2O is emitted, but the GWP is 300 compared to CO2 is a value of 1. And so you don't really have to actually emit very much of this stuff for it to be a huge effect. So that would be obviously, you know, that's on the future slate. But yeah, that's a good point.
Do you factor in the possible changes in the world from climate change in your model, like facilities for production?
Yeah, I don't. That would be another interesting sort of feedback to include in the model. And I don't know, I don't look at that literature enough to understand what's the general trend. I mean, is the idea that NPP is going to go down with climate change or due to drought stress, or I'm not sure what the, do you know what the result is or what the projections are? Well, yeah. Good point.
Do you have any data as to what the percentage of fuel used in short trips versus long trips? You know, the curve of total fuel versus mileage, such that electric vehicles can cut off that portion and stabilize the electricity production by evening out the daily cycle?
Sure, this is something that would be, and so there would be that effect to account for, and then there would also be the effect of you know, short haul versus aviation transport, for example, because this just lumps them all together. So if you were able to differentiate based on trip length, you could do EVs versus internal combustion engines, and then you could also do ground transport versus air transport, which would be another useful factor to include. You know, again, most of the reason that a lot of this is so simple is because I'm only one person, so if you want to help, send me an email.
What about the use of, does your model account for the use of nuclear power to actually to generate coal to liquid or gas to liquid?
No. One of the good things about it is, I said a weakness is that these models, they're essentially, you can draw a box and then write the 5 parameters in the box. That's the extent to which technologies are specified in here. So it would be really easy to make a coal pathway with carbon capture, where the CO2 emissions parameter would go down, the cost parameter would go up, and then you could test under what sort of worlds would coal liquids with capture, which could actually make them, you know, be approximately equal to conventional fuels. In what world would that make sense? Or coal liquids using nuclear as, you know, for hydrogen generation, for example. That would be another technology pathway. And they're fairly easy to specify, and they can actually be inserted in the model in like a couple lines of code. So it's no big deal. So that's one of the useful things about the model. But I haven't, as you can tell, there's only like 8 technologies. I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at technologies. But yeah, that would be a useful fuel cycle to look at.
Have you looked at, considered a hard cap on CO2 emissions versus max?
Yeah, so this is actually something that someone suggested in the last time I presented this talk in Berkeley, which was 3 weeks ago. They suggested it, and this is a related idea. They said, well, don't make these constraints on the rate of growth or any of these other things actually put a constraint in it, or in addition put a constraint on CO2, like a hard cap, and then say what would the effects of that be under these different worlds. This technology change rate, this rate of cost decrease in cellulosic ethanol, that sort of thing. So it's almost kind of working backwards a little bit and saying what would it take to freeze, if we froze CO2 emissions from this sector at this level or cap them at that level. Yeah, so that'd be an interesting thing to play with. And so I was planning, and I wrote that last time he said that, I wrote that down really quick. I said, this is one of the things I'm going to do in my paper. Thank you. So yeah, I'm planning on doing something like that.
In fact, that's what the current bill that is proposed is doing, right? Imposing that limit on oil industry.
Are you talking about the waxman market bill?
Yeah, maximum market.
Yeah, I haven't followed that very closely, but that may be the case. Oh, that's close.
I wonder if I could return to the original question you sort of put up, is how do we use models for decision making?
Sure.
And play devil's advocate for a minute.
Sure.
It's really interesting work, and you've shown how by varying several parameters we can visualize across these decision spaces to get a sense of what the robustness of some of these conclusions are. But you had a fact of Smill, his argument is basically don't do modeling, don't do forecasting, because you always miss parameters. And I wonder if you could maybe return to that and sort of add some thoughts about how this approach gets at those issues.
Yeah, and the answer is that's sort of the big problem. That's kind of the elephant in the room. So his main critique is, as you mentioned, Volkov Smiel, is this sort of failure of imagination. So basically, we don't really know what fuel cycles are going to be generated in the future. It very easily could be, massive deployment of, nuclear-fueled coal conversion, for example, which the model doesn't include. And since it doesn't include it, by default, it can't really model the effects of that being in the world because it doesn't include it. And so another big, I think probably one of the biggest potential shorts or blind spots here is the potential for advanced biofuels. I mean, I just have, kind of current cellulose and current grain ethanol. What about these engineered microbes that spit out synthetic hydrocarbons or, that have had heavy-duty genetic engineering? I mean, these things could really be game changers. And it's really difficult to include them in this sort of model, except perhaps, and this is something that I've been thinking about, except perhaps as sort of a generic future technology. And this might be the way I try to get around the issue you brought up. So a generic advanced biofuel, and since the biofuels, or since each technology is only specified with like 5 parameters, I don't really have to say what it is. It could be massive algae farming in the ocean, or it could be engineered microbes that produce synthetic hydrocarbons. But I say this is just this sort of advanced future biofuel with these properties. Costs of ABC, emissions of this, conversion efficiency of that, right? And then you could say, well, what if this game-changing technology comes on? What would the effects be on this sort of system behavior? And that's one way to get around it, although it's imperfect, and I know it's sort of hokey a little bit. It's kind of, you're kind of like, okay, what if we have this really game-changing technology, and you're just sort of inventing things out of thin air? But there's really no way to really capture what's going to happen over the next 40 years. So it's a hard problem.
We'll think this will be the last question.
A lot of work in progress.
Yeah.
Are you too nervous to either act as a futurist or a politician and say, from your gut feeling, what you've done so far, what's going to happen, or what is it pointing towards should happen? You can just say it's not your business.
I wouldn't say it's not my business.
I mean, you're not into that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super into that because I'm more useful in developing something that people can sit down. Ideally, you'd have something like this, and this is something that Lempert and others are working on, a software that's really easy to use, and you could sit down with decision makers and say, look, this is our model. Play with this parameter and this parameter. You two disagree about that. Let's put both of them in there and see if an action is robust across both of those. And so that's really interesting to me, kind of moving beyond the divisiveness of these debates sometimes and, well, I care about climate change, well, I care about economics, well, let's find something that works together. And the technology that appears to, or the sort of action, the near-term action we can take that seems to have the most broad benefit, the most blue across those 6 plots, because those are all blue is better, red is worse, right? I engineered them so that blue is better in all of them, is this demand reduction, this decoupling, All right, so if we can reduce the amount of demand we have per unit of GDP, switching to Priuses or PHEVs or any of these future advanced technologies, you get a lot of the benefit without some of the drawbacks, like this increased MPP consumption with cellulosic fuels, right? And so this efficiency, and this is something, you don't need, this 100,000 decision variable model to tell you this about efficiency. I mean, people have said this about efficiency for 40 years. But it's neat that it sort of falls out that, you just put it in there, and then this is the result that comes out across multiple metrics. That's kind of neat. So I would say, efficiency looks pretty good across these metrics, and that's comforting. So, but yeah, it's hard to address that, I guess.
All right, well, let's thank Adam.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.